Live stream has started? Okay. Well, the Lord be with you. And also with all of us, yes. Good morning. I got to stay far away with you or we'll get the back feed there. So, first of all, a couple of housekeeping matters. Our schedule here in the spring is a little bit wonky, but this week and next week, I'll be talking about loyal opposition, and then we get to Palm Sunday and Easter, and we don't have class during that time. And then after Easter, Brad Beach will be starting a series on peacemaking. But then he has a Sunday where he's out of town. So I'll be back in, and I'm going to try to connect peacemaking to some of the other things that we have here. And then Brad will come back again, and whatever happens, we'll make it through. So there is that. Also, in a bit of shameless grandfatherly expression of pride, I have to, whoops, there we are. Whoops. Oh, there we are, okay. There's our grandson. Casey Martin, that we went and saw last week, and of course he is a bundle of joy. So for this morning is going to be quite a bit of history and civics, because number one, as a grandfather, I have to show a grandson, and number two, as a historian, I just can't get away from history. There's certain things I can't help myself on. But I think the history helps us get some perspective, and in thinking about history, we're also going to think about human nature and different ways of thinking about human nature, trying to get a clearer understanding of how human nature plays out, particularly how sin plays out. And God's grace, hopefully, will come in there as well, because it matters. What we think about human beings matters in terms of how we go about doing things, or what we assume about human beings matters about how we go doing things. And, so the verse that we had 2 weeks ago was from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eyes, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? And it was brought up that means, but we can't just be passive. Even though we need to work at our own misperceptions and sinful thinking, we still have to do something. And that came up a good question right at the end. And that made me think, and as I came back and looked at this, I noticed, or something I just hadn't thought much about, is that Jesus says, why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, not the log in your own eye? Take the log out of your own eye. And then at the very end he says, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. There actually is that part where we do need to work on whatever, the flaws or the sins or the misperceptions of others as well. But we need to start, of course, with ourselves. And Jesus says it's a log versus a speck, so let's not assume that we're the speck instead of the log. And the second thing about this passage is Jesus, many times in the New Testament, uses the metaphor of sight. To see, are you seeing clearly, right? Why do you see the speck in your own eye? And there's other times when Jesus talks about the ways that we see. And I think one way to interpret this when he's talking about sight is he's talking about our thinking and our perceptions. And our thinking and our perceptions can very easily get distorted. We see the speck in somebody else's eye, but we don't see the log in our own eye. And in John 9, I think, he talks to the Pharisees about, are you blind or not blind? When he heals the blind man's sight, and you do not see. And the Pharisees, what do you mean we do not see? And it's about perception. And so I think the most common way that we misperceive things is we think of ourselves more highly than we ought. We have more faith in our own judgment and abilities and goodness than is warranted. And I think that's just true of human beings. So now we get down to that human nature. And I think this is a fundamental point about why we need to think about the loyal opposition. Because unsurprisingly, this happens with our leaders also, that they think more highly of themselves than they ought to, whether we're talking about presidents or members of Congress or actually outside of government also, not just monarchs and emperors, but business executives and school administrators and movie directors and pastors. Just a little aside here. There was... Christianity Today put out a podcast about a church. It's an excellent, excellent podcast series of about, 17 episodes or so. There was a mega church in Seattle that got to be very, very big and very, very famous called Mars Hill. And the pastor, Mark Driscoll, was a very, very gifted speaker. But the church grew very, very big and then launched like a dozen satellites and ended up with 25,000 people in the various satellites, and very influential with influence on other evangelical pastors and so forth. But part of the problem was that the pastor got to the point where he would not tolerate opposition or dissent. He was not, it was very, very hard to be held accountable. And there were elders that tried to hold him accountable, and he managed to kick them off, and then he'd go publicly before the congregation and basically blame the elders for being sinful and not being under the kingdom of God. And he talked about his church, and it was one of those things where power gets out of control. And then eventually problems came up, and the entire church just collapsed in a matter of like 3 months into nothing. And there were a lot of people that were wounded and deeply hurt, and some people who lost their faith. Although what I like about the podcast is that it also, number one, talks about and interviews people who were really spiritually grew in the midst of this. It's not all evil. It's like God working even in the midst of the problems there, number one. And then also number two, one of the points of the podcast is we're part of the problem. We're all part of the problem because we oftentimes contribute to various elements that can produce something like this. Anyway, that's a sidelight to say that the idea of the loyal opposition ought to be present in our churches also. By the way, Presbyterians have things built in to the system, right? We have our yearly meeting, and the pastors leave. We can talk about them, right? I mean, that prevents, a charismatic pastor from really manipulating or controlling people. There are other things in the structure of Presbyterianism which I think help exemplify this. Because Presbyterians believe in sin. Or they believe that, we even pastors need to be held accountable. Good, wonderful pastors, and we do have good and wonderful pastors, but all of us need to be held accountable. So anyway, that's a little bit of a sidelight on that. I want to go back then historically and talk about the time before, if this is going to do. I want to go back in the loyal opposition largely grows out of the English-speaking world and then spreads to other people. But I want to go back to the time in the English-speaking world when we didn't have a loyal opposition, and that we go back to about 1600 to the first Stuart kings and the time before that. And is that we're seeing if we can get this work. I mean, all I have up here are going to have some pictures of some kings. It's not that thrilling, but yeah. And so James I and Charles I is in some ways the beginning of the development of the loyal opposition. And the question is, we can boil the question down maybe this way: is dissent okay? Can you challenge the king and say, we think you're wrong on this, we need to adjust this? And the answer that James and Charles gave was, no, you can't do that. We are the king. They both believed in the divine right of kings, as did many other monarchs in Europe at the time. God had placed them on the throne. They have the right to make and implement all laws. Now, I do want to mention they are not the Nietzschean will to power guys. If you remember Brad talking about Nietzsche and the postmodern understanding of, they did believe there is, and this is an important part of the loyal opposition, you're loyal to an ultimate truth that governs society or government or the law. And that is what you need to uphold. And Nietzsche comes along and says that doesn't exist anymore, or we don't believe in that anymore. And so now the kings did say, yeah, we are accountable to God. Which is something. I don't think it's enough because human nature, kings are still human, but it was something. But Charles said to oppose the monarch is a sin. If you're disagreeing with me, if you are opposing the royal will, that is a sin. Now, it turned out to be a problem for both James, but especially for Charles, who, if you're into dark humor, Monty Python has a song about Oliver Cromwell that says that Charles started out his reign at 5'6" and ended it at 4'8". Okay, dark humor, because he was beheaded. What happened under James and Charles is you had this increasing conflict with Parliament that eventually ended in the English Civil War. And eventually Charles was captured and executed. And the problem in England, I won't go into all the details, but Parliament was in charge of, not in charge of, Parliament had a role, and there were two issues that the king and Parliament ran into, which, interestingly enough, are issues that come up in America and American history that people get really, really passionate about. Number one, religion. Number two, taxes. You know, the two most important things in our life, right? And so in that struggle, Parliament oftentimes opposed the king, and the king thought the Parliament, looked upon Parliament as just a group of advisors or his highest council. And Parliament said, no, we are a separate, we are actually a separate body, and this is our responsibility to decide, to approve whether you have this money to spend, which actually is right built into our Constitution. Congress raises the money, and they're the ones who approve the money, and then the president, as in the executive branch, carries things out. But here's the other thing. Parliament, they didn't really believe in the loyal opposition either. It was more of a question of, well, the king's just wrong. We don't believe that dissent is okay. We just believe that sometimes the king is just violating, the principles that are in here. And so it takes a while for this to develop. There are the guys. Yeah, Jim and Chuck. But I want to mention this for America because during this time, during the time of James and Charles, there was a group of people who were, number one, disagreeing with the king on religion. Mainly, the Stuart kings tended to pull the Anglican Church closer to Catholicism, and there was another group that wanted to pull the church towards Calvinism. They were the Puritans, also the Pilgrims. Right? They wanted a pure church. And for some Puritans in England, things got so bad they said, we're going to come to America and form a brand new Christian commonwealth, a Christian society. There were two groups. Pilgrims were just a small group that came in 1619, and the Puritans came. I always tell students, they're really pretty much, they're very, very similar. The differences are there, but only Pilgrims and Puritans can tell the differences. It's like people from New Philadelphia and Dover, right? I mean, to them, the differences run very deep. But for those of us in Stark County, we're like, anyway. So they, and eventually they will merge together in New England. And the way sometimes this is told historically is they came for religious freedom, but that they didn't grant religious freedom to anybody else. They're hypocrites. Well, no, they're not hypocrites, because they didn't believe in religious freedom. They're actually true to their principles, and their principle was everybody's got to be on the same page. Religious freedom takes a while to develop. And so they say, we just believe we are right. We're going to form a Christian community here, and everybody, in essence, is going to be under the same system. So you do not get, even with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who are strongly more middle class, and so on the taxes thing, they were with Parliament. They tended to support Parliament in the conflict in England. They don't really believe in the idea of a loyal opposition either. But I want to point out one place where it does start, and that is that the Puritans settle in America, and the other thing is they're Protestants, and Protestants have the strange dynamic. Protestants at the time, they believed in an established church, and yet they were formed by breaking away, dissenting from the Catholic Church. They are protesters. So it's almost like, I can go into the details on this, but I'm not, but they have within their DNA this impulse to protest, if you will, which is a dissenting impulse. And so if you take a bunch of Protestants and you put them together in Massachusetts and Connecticut and say, build a Christian society with those impulses, after a while, somebody's going to dissent. They're going to disagree on something, and something serious enough that it's going to cause a break. And eventually that takes place. And by eventually, I mean 5 years. When you have a serious break. It doesn't take long at all to break from this Christian society. And so, I wonder if this will work. Yeah, so I'll just go on that. The key person to break was a Puritan minister, Roger Williams, who had a disagreement over Indians. He thought they should pay for the land. That's another whole issue. But the one we want to talk about is what we might call today a church-state issue. They didn't really call it a church-state issue, but it is a government issue, and exactly how you're supposed to form a Christian society. And Roger Williams said, you know, the first 4 commandments are commandments between human beings and God. The commandments 5 through 10 are between human beings, relationships between one and another. And human beings, you cannot, you know, this is a good Protestant way of thinking. My relationship with God, to put it in modern terms, is between me and God, or rather, God knows what that relationship is. And you can't judge somebody else in terms of exactly what's going on in their heart with God. That's how we would talk about it today. But in essence, that's what Roger Williams is saying. And he concludes then, the government should not be in the business of trying to enforce that relationship between somebody else and God. Because, you know, you don't know what's going on inside of that person, or even exactly what God thinks on these things. Now, the government can enforce the other commandments. So, you know, stealing, for instance. Sure, you should have laws against stealing. Guess what? We still have laws against stealing. We don't have laws against adultery, but we do have laws against abusing somebody sexually, which we need to do better at upholding. But anyway, it's the relationships among humans, that's what government can enforce. And the other Puritan minister said, things are going to fall apart if you do that. And they got into a big debate. And they kicked Roger Williams out of the community. And he went south from Boston and established Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, he set up a what becomes a different colony, got a charter from the king eventually. And he set it up on this principle that what we would think of as religious freedom, that the government is not going to try to decide if you believe your doctrine is this way and somebody else is this. If your doctrine disagrees with me, we're going to allow you to. I can't enforce that. The government can't enforce whether you're right or wrong on doctrinal issues between you and God, that are based on the first 4 commandments. Which means you have to put up with people you disagree with theologically, and some of them are very, very annoying, especially those Quakers. Because eventually Quakers come to Rhode Island, because this is a good deal, and Quakers were considered radical at the time. And in fact, and Roger Williams did not like the Quakers, but he said, but I can't, number one, keep them out, and I can't throw them in jail for believing something different in many ways. George Fox, who's considered the founder of the Friends of the Quakers, came to Rhode Island in the 1670s, and he was going to debate Roger Williams, and then, I don't know, he had problems with plane tickets or something and had to go back to England. But Roger Williams did get into a debate with Quaker leaders, and they were both really pretty hot and angry at one another. The Friends called Roger Williams that bitter old man. And Williams called the Friends as a group, it was a group that was set on fire from the hell of lies and fury. Okay, so they're being pretty angry, but here's the point. Nobody was thrown in jail. Nobody was kicked out. Nobody, I mean, it was not a very civil disagreement, but it was a peaceful disagreement. You were not using force to try to bring everybody according to an established way of ruling things. And that's a key component of the loyal opposition. And I think in many ways it's underestimated as an influence, because at this time, if I can disagree with you on religious matters without trying to throw you in jail or execute you or kick you out or force you to conform, but we can live together even if we're really angry together, then, I mean, on religious matters, which we care a lot about, then I ought to be able to disagree with you on, I don't know, taxes, which for some people is also a religious matter. I understand that. But, other political matters we ought to be able to disagree on. And John Locke, who later in England was a big influence in establishing, the first stages of religious freedom in England, drew a lot from Roger Williams and the Quakers. I mean, he studied and drew from them. And then later William Penn establishes Pennsylvania, and the Quakers have a very similar sort of way of thinking about religious disagreement, because they were dissenters and outsiders and wanted to live in peace. And so you have Rhode Island and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which was also pretty much established by Quakers, as models for religious freedom, which has this component of the loyal opposition, which later will become the norm when we get to the Constitution. And, Virginia and others say we don't want a nationally established church, and they look to these colonies as a model for, we can make this work. Been doing it for 80 years, 90, well, by that time 100. Sorry, I have to do all that math in my head. So that's a step forward, and I can't go into, in fact, I don't know all the ways that the loyal opposition idea develops, but I just wanted to give that as an example of this. Dan?
Just really quick, your reflections on, if you have two opposing forces, then force happens between the two. What is the thing that allows them to disagree? By your own terms, it's the loyal opposition. In this situation, did they believe in one God? Did they believe in one society? Did they believe in peanut butter and jelly? I don't know.
Right. right. And that's a very good question. What is the basis on which you're saying? You do have to have, and that's a very good point, you do have to have a common set of principles. And initially in these colonies, it was defined largely as Christian in some way. And so then they had to debate, well, does that include Catholics? And for some colonies, no, that's out of bounds. But then for others, no, it will include Catholics. Does it include Jews? So initially it was a religious question. And they say, are there some basic religious principles we can agree on? When we get to the time of the Constitution, then the language of rights becomes sort of the ways of, can we agree that this is a right, that religious freedom is a right, that the freedom of speech is a right? And that becomes the means, and then we embody that written in the Constitution. That becomes the means on which we can work out those disagreements. Does that help address your question? That's a simplified answer. But here's the thing. It's difficult. It is really difficult, and it's an ongoing process to try to work through those kinds of things. And later on, maybe next week, we'll get to the problem of, what if some people are not people of goodwill? What do we do with that? We would call that the disloyal opposition. Like, I'd like just to take over the country and rule it with an iron fist. That's a great question, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that next week, because that's where things get tricky also. But I wanted to hit sort of how this develops this way. And I want to say this. I think that you can call the loyal opposition a cultural virtue. You might call it a tradition. You might call it a cultural norm, because it's not necessarily written down, except, the British have it written down in law. But it's what is socially acceptable or considered socially good. And I want to just point out a way that Aristotle, you talked about Aristotle last week, right? Talks about virtue. And he has, first of all, he says we have to grow and we have to learn virtue. And I'm simplifying things quite a bit here. But, if you're raising children, you want to teach them right and wrong. That's teaching virtue. And so the first thing you have to do is they have to learn what virtue is, and you have to learn you're going to behave according to virtue. Well, how do you get your kids to act according to virtue? Well, you need to do the timeout. The timeout chair is doing things according to the kid keeps, doing something wrong. You put them in timeout. It used to be spanking, but we don't do that anymore. Whatever it is the parents do to discipline. And so the child learns, if I do the wrong thing, I'm going to have this punishment, and the punishment is going to be greater than what the virtue is. And I learn to do things according to virtue. That's not what the child says, but, because mom and dad says so. Or then eventually you can also get to the point where you get rewarded for doing the right thing. Okay, well, I'm going to do the right thing because I get rewarded for it. Mom and dad say, then we get to go to McDonald's if we, do whatever, And then usually, it's the carrot and the stick and the sort of thing. But you're doing things according to these external sort of standards that somebody in authority has laid down. Now, what Aristotle says, eventually, if you work on it, you get to the point where that just becomes who you are. It comes from within, that you do the right thing because you love doing the right thing. And this maps pretty well, actually, with Jesus' whole Sermon on the Mount, really. If you talk about, Jesus is inherent, there's the law. We inherit the law from the Jews. And he says in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said to men of old, you shall not murder, okay? That's according to virtue. But I say to you, anybody who is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. Anybody who murders is liable to judgment. If you're angry with your, Jesus is saying, it's got to be from within you. You've heard that it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, anybody who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery in his heart. You've got to work towards the point of what we would call godliness or sanctification, where it just becomes a part of who you are. So you get to the point where when nobody's looking, what are you doing? If you're not going to be, you're not going to be caught, are you still going to do the right thing? Yes, I'm going to do the right thing because I love doing the right thing. That's the most important thing. Even if I know you're going to cheat on your taxes, Pretty sure I won't get caught on this? No, it's the right thing to do what is right. There's always that stick out there somewhere where you might get a call from the IRS or, whatever it might be. Now, of course, from virtue is a great goal. But here's the reality. Most people, there's a lot of things people just aren't going to do from virtue. And so what I want to, when I'm talking about the loyal opposition, I actually want, it'd be great if everybody could be virtuous. But look at the world we're in. But it'd be great if we could set up a system where at least we can do things according to virtue, that if we have set standards and laws that are embedded in practice, then, and there are proper rewards and punishments, then society will operate on a better basis, and the church can do what the church has the freedom, really, to do what it does to try to, invite and nurture and bring people in and grow in holiness and so forth. Well, on part of that then means, how do you have, we believe in freedom in a democratic societies as good things. What are the virtues there, even if it's according to virtue and not from virtue? What are those? And there's a lot of them, but let me point out two of them. One is, very early on, the founders realized, and this comes from John Locke, that whoever's in authority, the government that is in authority, does so with the consent of the people. There is that phrase. And you've heard this. This goes back probably to 8th grade civics, or maybe before that, or whatever, right? We recognize that as long as the government in authority has the consent of the people, they have the right to rule. But if they no longer have the consent of the people have the right to change the government. Overthrow the government. And of course, consent, this is something we know, we embrace, we love, we recognize it. And so this is why we emphasize voting. Get out and vote. That has what demonstrates the consent of the people. And the Declaration of Independence actually says this, right? Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Here's the basis, that the people have to agree to the government. Okay, that's great. We know what that is. We talk about this all the time. And usually we stop there. And we need to go a little bit further. Because the second one is, I would say, is actually the loyal opposition also has to be a cultural virtue. And they are closely related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Because it is quite possible to have a society in which you have the consent of the people, but you don't have a tradition or a virtue of a loyal opposition. And then things can get bad. You know why? Because people are sinful. It comes back to human nature. Let me give you one example that demonstrates this. Let us go to the French Revolution. And let's talk, first of all, with the main theorist of the French, the biggest influence theoretically, philosophically on the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Truth in Advertising, I'm not a big fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but his ideas were very, very influential among the French. And this is what he says before the French Revolution. His most famous phrase, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, which, by the way, Karl Marx will later riff on and say, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And he goes a little bit further with that and says that, well, the chains, born free, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, we are oppressed by things outside of us. Because in our natural state, when we are born and in the beginning of humanity, we're actually good and clear. It's the other things that oppress us. So he says, vice and error are foreign to the human constitution, invade it from the outside and imperceptibly alter it. His view of human nature is really we're naturally sort of good, and the bad things I do are because of things that have influenced me and oppressed me, and it doesn't come from within me. It comes from whatever, bad teaching or parents or society or all these sort of things. Now, I believe he is right that, external things do tempt us and press us and cause us to do bad things. But it's also saying that basically, human sinfulness, we don't have a problem inside of us. And as a good Presbyterian, I just don't want to bring that up. We're actually a Christian, right? I've got this sinful nature that has to be dealt with. So that's, I would say, the first reason why I disagree with Ruth Rousseau on human nature. Then I want to point out another thing that he said when he was talking about government. He brought up this phrase that he called the general will. As long as men, united together, look upon themselves as a single body, they have but one will relating to the common preservation and general welfare. The result is peace, union, and equality. This optimistic view that if we can get everybody on the right principles, the general will, what we all agree is right and true, we will end up with peace and union and equality. And we have our own version of this in the United States, which I'll talk about in just a minute. We don't call it the general will, we usually call it we the people. The people have spoken. If you put the people together, then we've got things set correctly. Well, but now you have a problem, because what happens when some people disagree? And Rousseau says, in essence, well, they're wrong. And if that's true, they are disagreeing, they're opposing something that is very, very good. And he says, therefore, what you need to do is, this is the great quote here, whoever refuses to obey the general will be forced to do so by the entire body. This means merely that he will be forced to be free. You see the problem? You may have to force people to be free. And this follows logically from everything else we say. If we are basically good, then those who are wrong are being, wrongly shaped by things outside of themselves. And so to be free, we may just have to force them into it. Does this have practical applications? Okay, so let's go to the French Revolution very, very quickly and move over. So it was an oppressive system in France at the time Rousseau was writing. You have monarchs and the nobility who did not pay any taxes at all, but held most of the money. And masses and masses of poor people in France, and besides that, they were being oppressed and so forth. And it all boils up into the French Revolution in 1789. And first of all, they met in their parliament for the first time in 130 years. And started to write a new constitution and so forth. And then they stormed the Bastille, and that's the beginning. And over the next couple of years, now they're going to try to work out what this means that we have shifted in our government. And they write a constitution, and they have elections. And in the constitution, they have rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that they believe applies to everybody. And you have certain freedoms that are guaranteed. You've got the slogans, basic principles, liberty, equality, fraternité, which is like patriotism or nationalism. Great. But as they're working out, of course, you're going to run into real practical problems. And there's a group of people, the more radicals, the Jacobins, who say, well, look, we're still not getting places. We're running into problems. And the problem is with those old people that hold power, the nobility. And this particular radical, Jean-Paul Marat, said famously at some point, look, the solution to our problem is 270,000 heads. Why that number? If you added up all the people in what was called the First and Second Estate, all the aristocrats and all the leaders of the church, you come up with 270,000. If we just kill all of them, humankind will be happy. He also coined the phrase enemies of the people. See, they are the enemies of the people. And now when we're talking about the people, we're talking about the general will, right? And you see how we do not have a sense of a loyal opposition here. The problem is other people, it's these particular people. If we can just eliminate them, if we can just clear out, then we will be free and we will be happy. And he led a group that began, at first it started small, and there were certain aristocrats and other people who were opposing what they were saying, and they put them on trial and executed them. And as some of you know in their basic history, it got bad. in what is known as the Reign of Terror. Sorry, before we get to the U.S. Constitution. At one point, well, overall, 25,000 people in the countryside were executed, and thousands of others were jailed. One of the Jacobin leaders, Robespierre, was opposed by a particular town, a lot of people in town called Lyon, and with his military force, he took the protesters and lined them up and just shot them, with cannons, and killed more than 2,000, people. Okay, all this, the Jacobins would say, was with the consent of the people. So, who decides what the people really believe? How do we know what wait a minute, were the people for the Jacobins or were they against the Jacobins? Because also it gets complicated because you have the aristocrats, you have the Jacobins, and you have the moderates in between. There's, the Girondists, and Jean-Paul Marat was deeply opposed to, for instance, Lafayette, whom we like as Americans, who was a nobility, but he believed in, basically his thinking was right along the lines of George Washington. So it is possible, and the Jacobins had a lot of support of poor urban people too. It's possible to have widespread support for something that turns out to be destructive to society and oppressive. Now, in the United States, the basic idea is there also. We say we the people, and by the way, as a starting point, I think it's really just kind of fine. Let's think about what the people believe and what the people want. That needs to be a factor. In our Constitution, we have, the preamble to the Constitution starts off with those famous words, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, do establish," and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so while the reign of terror is going on, the United States has already established, just a couple years before this, the Constitution in the summer of 1787. In Philadelphia, they were revising the existing government, the Articles of Confederation, come out with a Constitution, and it had to be approved and ratified by the states. Well, let me I can go about this a couple of different ways, but there's a lot of things to point out here about how things unfold. The United States at this time, even after the Constitution, still did not have a fully developed sense of the loyal opposition. We had parts of it in place. And the idea that power is going to be checked and checks and balances is consistent with the loyal opposition because it assumes that you can't give too much power to one person because no person or group of people is going to be purely good. James Madison said in Federalist 51, if men were angels, you wouldn't need government. You wouldn't need any government. If angels were to govern men, you wouldn't need, in essence, to have checks and balances. If we can find the angels out there, we're so good at finding politicians who are angels. We would, you can say the same thing about other areas. Can you find the angel to be the superintendent of your school? Or be the pastors of your church, or to be the manager of Taco Bell? Yeah, it covers a lot of different things, right? So we do start to get this filled out, though, with the sense of what do we do with dissent and what do we do with disagreement. And this wonky thing isn't quite working so well. And let me point out a few things. There's a lot of things that go into this. Let me point out a few things that contribute to this. First of all, George Washington I think rightly considered one of our greatest presidents, although I'm not sure that the reason I think he is great is the same as what reason other people think he is great. One of the greatest things I think George Washington ever did was to quit. And you probably know, he served 2 terms and then he stepped down. And I know when I was teaching high school, I was like, okay, this is what I've learned. He's setting a precedent. It's an example. And I was always kind of thought, yeah, but how important is that really? Well, that was 40 years ago in my life, 35 and so forth. Since then, I've come to say, no, this actually is really very, very important. Because, number one, there's still a lot of things that we're not sure how exactly they're going to do. And George Washington was extremely popular. He was a celebrity. Songs were written about him. Crowds came out. And so what he did really did matter. And by the way, one thing he could have done that he didn't do, which would have helped a lot, was free all his slaves. He considered it. He didn't do it. What if he had done that? All right, that's a sidelight. But to step down is even unconsciously, I don't know, consciously or unconsciously, it sort of sends the message that even George Washington shouldn't stay in power too long. That somebody else needs to take over. That even George Washington is not the same thing as the law. That there's a principle, and this is the way the founders taught. There are these principles we hold these truths to be self-evident. You know, that there are these principles we're going to hold on to. And by stepping down after 2 terms, Washington is saying, I am not above the law, and I am not the same thing as the law. And I think that was actually terribly important. I think it's the most important thing that he did. Quitting. Okay. So there is that, and it sends the message. And we put these things together, and I want to point out what I would call the problem of saying the consent of people is enough without thinking about the loyal opposition leads to what I would call the myth of totalitarianism. For those of you who are my age or older or a little bit younger, put yourself in any one of those categories. You might remember when we were growing up in the Cold War, we used this term totalitarianism. You know, the Nazis, that was a totalitarian society. The communism, that's a totalitarian society. And the underlying message, and sometimes the spoken message was, you know, the people really want to be free. But you've got this small group of people who are totally controlling everything, so the people can't really be free. It's kind of a Rousseauian way of thinking. And the myth here is this. A lot of times, people will give up their freedom for something. And a lot of times, people will support an authoritarian dictator, even a totalitarian government, and be happy with it. And this is why the consent of the people is not enough, because sometimes what the people consent to is something that is unjust. And I had 3 examples, but our PowerPoint is not working so well, and you don't need to see the, I guess, we're going to be stuck on the reign of terror. Going to have nightmares. Although this leads to one thing. After the reign of terror, my first example is this. After the reign of terror, there was a time when a committee kind of ran things, and that's maybe always a bad thing. But onto the scene steps a celebrity. And France was, you know, greatly unstable and a lot of difficulties. The celebrity is Napoleon. Napoleon was a brilliant general. He'd been fighting for France. And the people, you know, as celebrities go, he has a lot of popular support. And Napoleon has a coup d'etat, a coup. He just comes in with force, marches into Paris, basically tells the Directory, you're out, I'm in, or throw you in jail. And then he just took over. And then, though, here's the point. Do you know what he do after he came in power? And he wrote up a constitution, a new constitution, which gave the people some freedom, but also gave himself a lot of power. And then he said, but let's have the people vote on this. And the new Constitution gave him pretty much unlimited power for 10 years. And what happens? 3.5 million people said yes, only a few thousand said no. The French people overwhelmingly pretty much said, Napoleon, yes, you can have all the power you want. Then later he crowned himself emperor, and then you've really got power. And that was, he's not, there were some gains in rights, but largely this is an authoritarian government. And the people support it, partly because anarchy is a really, really terrible, terrible situation to live in. It's worse than a dictatorship. But today, 71% of the French still admire Napoleon. And in my head, I can understand why, because he makes them feel proud to be French. But in the other way, I'm like, he's an authoritarian leader. He's not democratic. Okay, so that's example number one. Example number two would be Latin America. There was a process in the 19th century, especially when Latin American countries had gotten their independence. And things are always unstable and difficult when you get independence. And sometimes things get pretty bad. And there was sort of this tradition that developed in many countries that when things get bad, you just want a strong leader to come in and set things right. And this was called the caudillo, which is like the cowboy, to come in, and usually they were a general or somebody, but a celebrity, to come in and you give them power, and you're willing to give up a lot of your freedoms in order to give a caudillo power. And that just became a tradition in many places in Latin America. Mexico, between 1821 and 1854, had more than 20 different presidents, different caudillos that came and went. Santa Anna was one of them. But it undermines a lot of aspects of justice, but you're just looking for somebody just to be strong and set things right. You're giving them a lot of power, and the people vote and supported that. Third example I would say is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, when he came in 1933, first of all, in the elections, he only got 44% of the vote, but he had enough allies to get a hold of the parliament, Reichstag, and the Reichstag voted support for him, and then the Reichstag pretty much voted all their powers away. And then, after Hitler was in power for like 8 or 9 months, he had a vote to the German people to become their Führer, which would merge the post of chancellor and president together. And also part of it was people were to pledge personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Not loyal to higher principles, loyal to a person. And the vote was, at that point, 90% approved of Adolf Hitler. There's a consent of the people. A lot of Germans thought, oh yeah, Adolf Hitler, he's good, we need him. Germany did not have a tradition of the loyal opposition. Because part of what happens when you're voting that power away is you're voting away the power to dissent and disagree. Certainly when you're voting for personal loyalty to a person, you are giving up your right to disagree or dissent. So, 2 thumbs up to George Washington for quitting. Very quickly, there are some quotes on here that I'd like to get. If this would, do I point this? Will it go? No, we're just not going to be here. So how do I want to end this? After George Washington stepped down, first of all, what happened, if you've ever watched the musical Hamilton, this becomes clear, that conflicts develop in George Washington's cabinet between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. If you haven't seen this musical, there's some historical facts that are wrong. Well, first of all, people didn't break out into song regularly or rap, but there's some great principles. There's some great principles in there, and the conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton did get kind of nasty sometimes under George Washington. And the ideal at the time is we should not have political parties, we should not have factions. We're going to disagree, but parties will just make this worse. But there weren't formal parties, but the factions develop anyway. When George Washington steps down, John Adams is elected president, and his faction is the Hamiltonian side and what became known as the Federalists. They passed a law called the Sedition Act. Oh, look at this. We've got things. And there it is. Briefly, hope you could read fast. But the Sedition Act, passed by Congress, which is controlled by Federalists, said deportation, fine, or imprisonment of anyone deemed a threat or publishing false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government of the United States. Can you imagine today trying to imprison everybody who says something scandalous? Sometimes there's that part of us that say, gee, I wish that would happen. Because, of course, that's always somebody else's, the other people are doing that, right? But see, we haven't got the loyal opposition quite right yet. And they did imprison, for instance, a man named Thomas Callender, who said that the reign of Mr. Adams has been one continued tempest of malignant passions. As president, he's never opened his lips or lifted his pen without threatening and scolding. The grand object of his administration has been to exasperate the rage of contending parties, to calumniate and destroy every man who differs from his opinion. Every person holding office must either quit it or think and vote exactly with Mr. Adams. Kind of a argument that he's not allowing for a loyal opposition. And that man, under the Sedition Act, was fined $200 and jailed for 9 months. See, and that's where you get an authoritarian. You go after somebody who criticizes you, and you say, and sometimes we say, well, the people in power have got bad motives. I think John Adams, he signed the bill. John Adams did not, well, anyway. I would say most of this came with the Federalists in Congress, but John Adams is responsible also because he signed the bill. I think a lot of times they were thinking, this is going to really weaken and destroy our new republic. This is an experiment. We don't know if this is going to work. And so to really say malicious things against the government is going to be bad. So we've got to have a law against it. Now, fortunately, that act, when they wrote it, was only going to be in effect for a few years, and it expired and was not renewed. But that takes us to the 1800 election, in which John Adams runs for election against Thomas Jefferson, and Adams loses the election. And here's where I give John Adams maybe as much credit as George Washington. He leaves. He quits. Or he voluntarily steps down. He loses well. In government, I am a fan of people who quit and lose well. And this election was, I'm running out of time, but I get into all the nasty, nasty stuff that was said here in this election. And there were Federalists who thought if Thomas Jefferson wins, Thomas Jefferson was kind of looked favorably on the French Revolution. Like, we're going to have riots here. People were really afraid. There were women in New England who were burying their Bibles because they thought Thomas Jefferson was going to destroy Christianity. On the other hand, there were Jefferson supporters who thought that there were rumors that John Adams was trying to marry his daughter to the King of England, and they're going to establish a monarchy in the United States. I mean, there's still misinformation then at the time. But Adams accepted it and he stepped down. And then Thomas Jefferson took over, and in his first speech, very famous line, Jefferson, look, we have our differences, but we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. 2 thumbs up for Thomas Jefferson. Because see, this is the loyal opposition also. We have our differences, but there's a higher principle. We're Americans, and there's this loyalty to the Constitution. This is what we ought to be shooting for. One thing I'm going to do next week is talk about a few more great losers in history, because I think that's actually, I think it's actually important. But I'm going to quit here because we're running out of time. And if we have time for just a couple of questions or comments, Courtney. I would say that's a great question, and actually a great qualification. Is loyal opposition a numbers thing, or is it a principle? And I would say that the most important part of the loyal opposition is a principle, but it plays out as a numbers thing in a democracy, right? Officially in Britain, that's how it plays out. But here's the reason why I say it's a principle, because the majority can be wrong, and oftentimes is wrong. A majority of Americans basically supported slavery or allowed it to take place for a long, long time. They were wrong. You know, there's always that minority. But the point of the loyal opposition is you need the minority to exist and be able to speak up and say, that's okay that they are dissenting. Now, the minority might be wrong too. There's some minority groups out there that are saying some crazy things. But that's why I say it's a principle first. But in practical terms, it plays out in numbers. The opposition, you know, we're a minority, but we're opposing the people in power. That's how it works in a democracy. So, Don.
I think it's a correction. You said that George Washington freed his slaves. I thought in his will he freed his slaves.
George Washington did have a will freeing his slaves. Martha did not like that, and her family did not like that. And so they did not, after he died, the family did not carry out that part of the will. They did not free the slaves. Wait a minute. Let me think, is that right? I think that is right. Maybe there were some slaves who were freed. Thomas Jefferson talked about freeing slaves. You know, when you've got power, there's the principle, then it's really, really hard to play out on that. Dan.
I'm using this term loosely of dualism.
Okay.
I realize there's other types.
Right.
We've talked about virtues today, good and wrong. And then there's the Buddhist concept of yin yang, where loyal opposition, the good, the bad, all work towards the good. And then I'm thinking of the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
The kingdom is ruled by God, but is he ruling as a warrior man concept of the kingdom? Or is this a spiritual kingdom that is more of the yin yang, the opposition?
Yeah.
Now my point is, I don't know where you're going with the class, but is there some consideration here of the kingdom, its structure, that we might look into this?
Yeah, and I think the basic model, and I think this is embedded in the loyal opposition, I would use, the most helpful model is actually Augustine's model of government. If we go back to Augustine, that mirrors some of what you're saying, that our ultimate allegiance is to the king, as Christians, our ultimate allegiance is to the kingdom of God, no matter what the sphere. But we also have to have government. And so you're going to have the city, or he called it the city of God. You also have the city of man, that he called, or the city of humans. And that, we need to have a government in place. There's a role and purpose for government. And it needs to have authority, needs to have power, needs to be able to have laws and punishments and that sort of thing. But that's going to be always flawed. And the loyal opposition, I think, implicitly recognizes people are going to be flawed, and that's why we need dissent on that. And that's a bit different from the East Asian idea of yin and yang, where it's not exactly good and evil, but sometimes it plays into that. It's more like there's dark and light, and there's like water and fire, and there's male and female, and everything is broken into a binary. And on one sense, it may be similar in that you have to have both of them, like you can have a dissenting sort of thing. But the basis on which you think about morality and ethics in that philosophy is different than what I think the Augustinian understanding of morality for a society. So one last question, and then I got to run and sing. Kate. Yeah.
I was thinking about in the Old Testament, where Israel's asking for a king and asking for a king, you know, and they're like, no, that's really not the best solution, but they keep pushing for it, and they eventually.
I think that's a very good idea, you know. I mean, I think it's a very good point, a connection. Why can't we have a king like everybody else? And we're going to put, and God says, well, this isn't going to work out real well. This isn't going to, but okay, we'll give you a king. You know, and you can have good kings. Not Saul, David after Saul. There were a couple good things about Saul. But yeah, that's a very good point. And you need some sort of government. This is our challenge. All right, next week, I'm going to get into how do we deal with this in various ways and a few other things. So thank you. Let me say a quick prayer. Father, we do thank you that we do have many good things about our society. We pray that you'd continue to help us to think and grow and learn about what our calling and role is in that. In your name we pray. Amen.